Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. Shake, Rattle, and Love. The heat in Memphis in July of 1956 was a physical presence. A thick, damp blanket that smelled of honeysuckle and hot asphalt. It seeped through the thick stone walls of the Magnolia Baptist Church, settling in the basement where 19-year-old Magnolia June Whitfield was committing a sin. Or, if not a sin, then something dangerously close to it. Sunlight, fractured by the stained glass windows of the sanctuary upstairs, fell in jewelled patterns across the scattered hymnal sheets and the scarred wood of the old upright piano. Her Sunday dress, a pale yellow cotton that her father had called the very picture of piety, rustled as she hunched over the keys. The same hands that played Amazing Grace with reverent grace on Sunday morning now carved out rhythms that felt like they could make the angels weep, or maybe, just maybe, make them want to dance. This was her secret. By day, she was the preacher's daughter, a model of quiet conformity. But in these stolen hours, with a pencil tucked behind her ear and her heart pounding a syncopated beat against her ribs, she was M.J. White. M.J. White, the mysterious lyricist whose words were currently crackling from radios all across the South, sung by a boy with a voice like lightning and a sneer that broke girls' hearts. 3 songs had made their way from this dusty basement to the airwaves, carried on scraps of paper she mailed to Sun Records with a trembling hand and a prayer for anonymity. Her fingers found a new chord, a bluesy, mournful sound that slid into something faster, something with a pulse. "Midnight train on a one-way track," she hummed, her voice a hushed whisper, so different from the clear soprano she used in the choir. The melody came first, always. It would rise into her, a wild, untamable thing, and she'd wrestle it onto the page, pinning it down with words that spoke of things she wasn't supposed to know. Lonely highways, stolen kisses, the desperate ache of wanting something you couldn't have. Her internal monologue was a constant frantic prayer. Every note I write feels like a prayer backwards, reaching for something wholly in the wrong direction. But she couldn't stop. This music was the only place she felt truly herself, the only place the suffocating weight of being Reverend Samuel Whitfield's perfect daughter was lifted. It was a language her soul spoke fluently, even if her mouth was forbidden to utter it. She scribbled furiously on a fresh sheet of manuscript paper, the graphite pencil scratching a rhythm of its own. Heartbreak engine, running hot and fast. Got a ticket to nowhere, hoping it'll last. The lyrics felt dangerous, illicit. They were the stories of the people her father preached about saving, the lost souls wandering in the wilderness. But to Magnolia, they didn't feel lost. They felt alive. A floorboard creaked overhead. She froze, her hand hovering over the page. "Magnolia, child?" Her father's voice. It was a voice made for pulpits and benedictions, deep and resonant. A sound that could both comfort a grieving widow and condemn a sinner in the same breath. It drifted down the wooden staircase in a familiar chill, part fear and part guilt, traced its way down her spine. "You're needed in the sanctuary," he called. Her heart hammered. With movements made swift by long practice, she gathered the loose sheets of her devil's music. She lifted a heavy stack of hymnals, the old rugged cross, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and slid her rockabilly confessions beneath them, bearing the raw, rebellious heartbeat of M.J. White under the steadfast piety of Magnolia June Whitfield. She smoothed her dress, took a deep, calming breath that did nothing to calm her, and forced a placid smile onto her face. As she climbed the stairs, the distant muffled sounds of Beale Street drifted through an open window. A saxophone's lonely wail, a burst of laughter, the low thrum of a world she was only allowed to glimpse. It was the world her music lived in, a world of neon signs and dance halls, a world that existed in stark, vibrant contrast to the hallowed silence of the sanctuary she was about to enter. She could still feel the phantom rhythm in her fingertips, a ghost of the song she'd been writing. It was a secret pulse, a second heartbeat, thrumming just beneath the surface of the quiet, obedient girl she pretended to be. And she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that one day the secret would have to come out. The sound was getting too loud to hide. The light at Sun Records was the colour of whiskey. It poured through the grimy windows in the late afternoon, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and curling through the grey plumes of cigarette smoke. This place was its own kind of church, cathedral of sound where Sam Phillips was the high priest and the new gospel was a raucous, hip-shaking beat called rock and roll, and Jackson Jax Tanner was its newest disciple. At 22, Jax moved with a restless energy, as if he were constantly hearing a rhythm no one else could. He had calloused hands from wrestling with his guitar, and eyes the colour of a summer storm just before it breaks. He was leaning against a recording console, listening to the playback of his latest track. The song was a scorcher, destined for the top of the charts, but it was the lyrics that haunted him. They were penned by the enigmatic MJ White, and they fit his voice, his soul, like they'd been tailored for him. Got a heart full of gravel and a soul full of gin. Don't know where I'm going, but I know where I've been. Who was this MJ White? The letters always arrived in plain envelopes, postmarked Memphis, the lyrics written on crisp manuscript paper, but the last one had been different. Tucked into the envelope, almost as an afterthought, was a small folded programme. On the front, an embossed cross and the words, Magnolia Baptist Church, Sunday Service. On the back, in the corner, a faint pencil smudge of a musical notation. A mistake. A clue. "Sam," Jack said, his voice a low drawl that cut through the music. "I'm going to find this ghost." An hour later, Jax's motorcycle rumbled to a stop across the street from the church. Evening service was letting out. Families in their Sunday best spilled onto the manicured lawn, their voices a polite murmur against the backdrop of singing cicadas. It was a world away from the raw energy of Sun Records. Then he saw her. She was standing on the steps, bathed in the amber glow of a streetlight that filtered through the heavy branches of a magnolia tree draped in Spanish moss. She was talking to an older man, the preacher by the look of his stern face and black suit. Jax's eyes weren't on her prim dress or the careful way she held her hands clasped in front of her. They were on her fingers. As she gestured, her long, slender fingers seemed to trace invisible melodies in the humid night air. The same fingers, he'd bet his soul, that wrote the notes smudged on the back of that church programme. He waited, the engine of his bike a low, rhythmic pulse like a waiting heartbeat. When the preacher went inside and she began to walk towards the quiet side street where a modest Ford was parked, he pushed off the kickstand and glided across the asphalt, cutting her off. Magnolia gasped, her hand flying to her chest. A man on a motorcycle, all black leather and denim, was blocking her path. He swung a leg over the bike, and in the dim light she recognised him instantly from the cover of a record sleeve in a shop window she'd hurried past just last week. Jackson Tanner. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice smoother than she expected, but with an edge to it. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tight with nerves. This was a collision of worlds she had spent her life keeping separate. He took a step closer into the pool of light. His stormy eyes scanned her face, then dropped to her hands, which she quickly hid in the folds of her skirt. "I think you can," he said softly. He reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a folded piece of sheet music. It was hers, the one with the lyrics for Midnight Highway. Those hands, they wrote this, didn't they? The world tilted. The sound of the cicadas grew deafeningly loud. Her secret, her precious, terrible secret, was staring her in the face with eyes that saw far too much. I don't know what you're talking about." A slow smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't lie to me, Angel. I saw you from across the street. I know rebellion when I see it, even when it's dressed up for church." He took another step, closing the space between them. He smelled of gasoline and something else, something wild and free. "I've been singing your words for 6 months. It feels like I know you, MJ White." He said the name, her name, and the sound of it in the open air felt like a judgment. Tears pricked her eyes, not of sadness, but of pure, unadulterated terror, and somewhere beneath it, a bizarre spark of relief. The weight was cracking. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This music, it's everything I am, and it's everything I can't be." He watched her, his expression softening from accusation to a kind of raw understanding. "Maybe," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you just need someone to help you be it." He looked from her frightened eyes to the stone church behind her, then back again. "The devil's at your door, Magnolia June. You gonna invite him in?" The invitation came at dawn. Jax had told her to meet him where the city ended and the river began, and as Magnolia crept out of the parsonage, the sky was a soft, bruised purple. Mist rose from the Mississippi like ghosts, shrouding the awakening Memphis skyline in a dreamlike haze. She saw him standing by the riverbank, a dark silhouette against the burgeoning light, skipping a flat stone across the water's placid surface. The air was cool and clean, filled with the sound of morning birds and the distant low hum of the city coming to life. It felt like the world spinning toward possibilities she'd only ever dreamed of in the darkness of the church basement. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," Jack said, not turning as she approached. The stone skipped 4 times before sinking without a trace. "I almost didn't," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. She clutched her cardigan tighter around herself, a useless shield against more than the morning chill. He finally turned to face her. In the soft morning light, the hard edges of his rock and roll persona seemed to have softened. He just looked like a young man with a heavy heart and a hopeful gaze. "I meant what I said last night," he began, his voice earnest. "Your words, they have a soul. People feel it. I feel it. Music like that doesn't belong in the shadows, Magnolia. It deserves a stage. It deserves a voice. Your voice." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "I'm starting a tour. 5 cities across the South. I want you to come with me, not as MJ White, the ghost in the machine, as you. We can tell people you co-wrote the songs, you can play piano, maybe even sing with me." The proposition hung in the air, shimmering with terrifying potential. It was everything she had ever secretly wanted. The open road, the music, played loud and proud. A life where she didn't have to hide the most essential part of herself. But then the image of her father's face rose in her mind, his disappointment, a force more powerful than any sermon. "I can't," she said, the words tasting like ash. "My father, the church, they would never understand. It would break his heart." As she spoke, a memory, sharp and painful, pierced through the morning mist. She was 10 years old, standing at her mother's bedside. The room smelled of sickness and fading roses. Her mother, her face pale and thin, had taken Magnolia's small hand. "Be good, my June bug," she'd whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Promise me you'll be good for your father. He'll need you to be his light." Magnolia had promised, and for 9 years she had tried to be nothing but that light, a perfect, steady flame of piety and obedience. This music, this man, this offer, it wasn't light, it were fire. Jax seemed to see the storm of conflict in her eyes. "My old man was a preacher too," he said quietly, surprising her. "He kicked me out when I was 17 for choosing a guitar over a Bible, said I was trading my salvation for a cheap thrill." He looked out at the river, his jaw tight. "For a long time I believed him. I thought you had to choose, but what you do, what we could do together. It ain't cheap. It's the most honest thing I've ever known." He stepped closer, his voice dropping with intensity. "Come with me, Magnolia. Just for the tour. Let Memphis hear what heaven really sounds like when it's got a little bit of hell in it." She looked from his face so full of passionate conviction to the wide, muddy river flowing beside them. The river was a boundary separating the life she knew from a life she could barely imagine. To cross it felt like a betrayal of every promise she had ever made. Her mother's dying wish, her father's unwavering faith, the safety of her entire world. A tugboat sounded its lonely horn in the distance, a mournful, resonant call. It sounded like a choice. She closed her eyes, and a different voice whispered from a place deep inside her, a voice that had been silenced for years. "Mother, forgive me," it said, "but I'm tired of being the daughter you needed instead of the woman I am." She opened her eyes and looked at Jax, the rising sun catching fire in his hair. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time it was eclipsed by a flicker of hope. "Okay," she heard herself say, the single word a stone skipping across the water, headed for the other side. "I'll go." 3 weeks felt like a lifetime. The girl who had crept out of the Memphis parsonage was gone, and in her place was Maggie June. The name was Jax's idea, a little bit of her past, a little bit of her future. And tonight, Maggie Jewel June was electric. The stage at the Cotton Club in Nashville was hot and bright, the lights blinding. Below, a sea of faces, teenagers mostly, screamed and danced, their bodies moving to a rhythm she had created in the sacred quiet of a church basement. She sat at a gleaming black piano, her fingers flying across the keys, no longer hiding. Beside her, Jax ripped a solo from his guitar, sweat beading on his brow, a grin of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. They launched into Midnight Highway, their biggest hit. When the chorus came, Jax stepped back from his microphone and nodded to her. It was her cue. For the first time on the tour, she was going to sing with him. She took a breath and her voice, clear and strong, blended with his. "Heartbreak engine running hot and fast. Got a ticket to nowhere, hoping it'll last." A roar went up from the crowd, a wave of energy so powerful it felt like it could lift the roof off the building. She caught Jax's eye, and in that moment, under the heat of the lights, with their voices tangled together in a song of her own making, she had never felt more alive, more completely herself. This wasn't sin. This was glorious. Backstage was a chaotic whirlwind of roadies, smoke and adrenaline. As the applause finally faded, Jax grabbed her hand, his eyes shining with a fierce pride. "Don't you see?" he said, his voice hoarse over the din. "This is who you're meant to be, wild and free and real." He pulled her into a small, cluttered dressing room away from the noise. The energy from the stage still crackled between them, an invisible current that had been building for weeks. It was in the shared glances, the hands that brushed in passing, the harmony of their voices. Now, in the sudden intimacy of the small room, it was overwhelming. He gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Magnolia," he whispered, using her real name like a prayer. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, stolen kiss. It was a kiss of homecoming, of recognition. It tasted of sweat and success and the promise of 1,000 more songs. All the longing she had ever poured onto paper, all the secret desire she'd hidden beneath hymnals, erupted in a firestorm of feeling. She kissed him back with all the pent-up passion of a girl who had just discovered she was free. Their embrace was broken by a frantic knock on the door. A harried-looking stage manager stuck his head in. "Maggie, Jax, there's a telegram for you, miss." He handed her the small yellow envelope. Her heart, which had been soaring moments before, plummeted. Telegrams only ever meant one thing. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. The stark black letters seemed to leap off the page. Reverend Whitfield suffered acute heart attack, critical, come home, church prays for your soul, Deacon Morrison. The roar of the crowd, still echoing in her ears, was replaced by a terrible, deafening silence. The world spun out of focus. Church prays for your soul. The words were a condemnation, a verdict. They weren't just praying for her father's health, they were blaming her for its failure. Her fall from grace had, in their eyes, literally broken her father's heart. The taste of triumph turned to ash in her mouth. The joy she'd felt on stage, the passion of Jax's kiss, now felt like a terrible, selfish betrayal. She looked from the telegram to Jax's worried face, and the beautiful, vibrant world they had started to build together crumbled into dust. She had chosen the fire, and in doing so she had burned down everything she'd left behind. The cost of her song was a price she wasn't sure she could bear to pay. 6 months later, the pews of Magnolia Baptist Church were filled for Sunday service. The Memphis heat was just as oppressive, but inside Magnolia's heart a fragile winter had given way to a tentative spring. She had come home, she had sat by her father's bedside, read him scripture, and held his hand through the long, quiet nights of his recovery. She had been the dutiful daughter once more, and in the crucible of that shared vulnerability, something had shifted between them. Her father, Reverend Samuel Whitfield, sat in the front pew, paler and thinner, but with a new softness in his eyes. His brush with mortality had scraped away some of the rigid certainty, leaving behind a man who was beginning to understand that God's world was wider and more mysterious than he had ever preached. Magnolia sat at the old upright piano, the same one where her secrets had been born. She was supposed to be playing the prelude, a traditional rendition of It Is Well With My Soul. Her fingers moved over the keys, the familiar chords filling the sanctuary, but the music inside her, the insistent, rebellious rhythm she had tried so hard to silence, would not die. It was a part of her soul, as sacred as any hymn. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to change the rhythm. A subtle syncopation crept into the left hand, a bluesy note slid into the melody. It was still the beloved hymn, but it now had a heartbeat, a gentle sway, a touch of the Beale Street soul she carried within her. A few heads in the congregation lifted. Deacon Morrison shot her a sharp, questioning look, but her father simply closed his eyes, a faint, knowing smile gracing his lips. As the last, transformed chord faded into the hallowed silence, the back door of the church creaked open. Jack stood there, framed in the morning light. He wasn't the swaggering rock star from the stage. He looked humbled, his usual restless energy replaced by a quiet reverence. He had performed their songs for months without her, and he'd discovered they were just words and notes. She had been the soul. His eyes found hers across the sanctuary, and in that single look, 6 months of pain, guilt, and longing were communicated and understood. After the service, her father approached them in the shade of the old magnolia tree. He looked at Jax, not with condemnation, but with a thoughtful curiosity. "Mr. Tanner," he said, his voice weaker but still resonant, "I have spent my life preaching about the word, but I am learning that the Lord speaks in many voices, even," he added with a glance at his daughter, "through guitars and drums." He placed a hand on Magnolia's shoulder. "I listened to one of your records, the one about the highway." He paused. "It sounded like a psalm for the lonely. Go, child, sing your psalms. Just promise me you'll remember the way home." It wasn't just permission, it was a blessing. Tears streamed down Magnolia's face as she hugged her father, a lifetime of fear and guilt washing away in a tide of grace. Later, standing with Jax by the riverbank where he'd first made his offer, they planned a new future, a new tour, one that didn't run from her roots but embraced them. They would write songs that bridged the gap between Saturday night and Sunday morning, between the sinner and the saint. Their wedding was held a year later in the same church where it all began. The stained glass windows cast their jewelled light on a strange and beautiful scene. Magnolia wore a simple white dress, her hair unbound. Jack stood beside her, his hand steady in hers. In the corner, his rockabilly band stood ready, not with amplifiers, but with acoustic guitars and a stand-up bass. When the ceremony was over, they didn't play the traditional wedding march. Instead, the first notes of Amazing Grace filled the sanctuary, played with a slow, soulful rockabilly swing. And as Magnolia and Jax walked down the aisle, the congregation, once so rigid in their piety, rose to their feet. They began to clap, then to sway, and soon the people of Magnolia Baptist Church were dancing, their joy a new and unconventional prayer. Love, they were all discovering, had a way of making all things sacred. It was the bridge between what was and what could be, the song that turned rebels into believers, and believers into something beautifully, wonderfully human. It was the rhythm that two hearts find together, the moment the real music begins. Catherine Mitchell ran her fingertips along the spines of weathered books, pausing occasionally to pull one from its resting place. The musty scent that filled Grayson's antiquarian books had become as familiar to her as her own apartment. At 28, her life had settled into comfortable predictability, weekdays at the New York Public Library where she worked as a reference librarian, and weekends hunting through second-hand bookshops for overlooked treasures. "Found anything worthwhile today, Katie?" Mr. Grayson called from behind the counter, where he was carefully reattaching the cover of a first edition Hemingway. "Nothing yet, but I can feel something waiting for me," she replied, pushing her wire-rimmed glasses back up her nose. Her mother always said she had a sixth sense for books, an ability to know when something special was nearby. Today, that sense led her to the back corner of the shop to a section she'd browsed dozens of times before. But somehow, a slim volume with a faded blue spine caught her eye, as if it had materialized from nowhere. She carefully extracted it from between two larger tomes. The Quiet Hours by Elizabeth Harmon. Catherine had never heard of the author, but the title resonated with her. The book wasn't particularly valuable, a 1950s novel that had likely enjoyed modest success before fading into obscurity. But when she opened it, her breath caught. The margins were filled with handwriting, not the occasional underline or star that readers sometimes left, but entire paragraphs of thoughtful commentary. The penmanship was distinctive, slightly slanted to the right, with crisp consonants and flowing loops. Harmon captures the essence of solitude without making it seem pathetic, read one note beside a description of the protagonist walking alone through autumn woods. There's dignity in choosing one's own company, in listening to thoughts that can only be heard in silence. Catherine found herself scanning pages, not for the author's words, but for the annotations. The unknown reader had engaged with the text as if in conversation with it, challenging some passages and expressing deep appreciation for others. There was humour. "If I wrote a letter this melodramatic, I'd burn it before the ink dried." An unexpected vulnerability. "I've stood at this same precipice, wondering if anyone would notice if I simply stepped off." She checked the inside cover and found what she was looking for, a name written in the same distinctive hand. Gary Wilson, 1968. Catherine bought the book without hesitation, paying more than its objective worth, but far less than its value to her. That evening, curled in her apartment's window seat as rain tapped against the glass, she read the entire novel, letting Gary Wilson's commentary guide her through the story. By midnight, she had made her decision. She would find him. The search proved more challenging than she'd anticipated. This was 1974, before the internet would make locating people a trivial matter. The New York phone directory listed 12 Gary Wilsons, none of whom, when carefully called, admitted to annotating old novels. Library records offered no help. Bookstore owners shook their heads. 3 weeks later, Catherine caught a break. Mr. Grayson remembered a customer named Wilson who had sold a collection of books the previous year. A decent fellow, former English professor, I believe, left an address for tax purposes. The address led to a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. Catherine stood on the sidewalk for 20 minutes, rehearsing what she would say, before finally mailing a letter instead. She wrote and rewrote it 7 times. Dear Mr. Wilson, my name is Catherine Mitchell. Recently I purchased a copy of Elizabeth Harmon's The Quiet Hours from Grayson's Antiquarian Books. I believe it once belonged to you, as it contains margin notes signed with your name. I hope you don't find this letter strange or intrusive, but I felt compelled to reach out. Your annotations transformed my experience of the novel. Your insights, humour and honesty spoke to me in ways the original text couldn't alone. I'm a librarian who has read thousands of books, but I've never encountered marginalia that felt like finding a kindred spirit across time. I simply wanted to thank you for inadvertently sharing your thoughts with a stranger. With appreciation, Catherine Mitchell. She included her return address, but expected nothing in response. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived, postmarked from a town she'd never heard of upstate. Dear Miss Mitchell, your letter provided the most pleasant surprise I've received in years. I'd completely forgotten about that old copy of The Quiet Hours, and I'm mildly embarrassed to know my scribbles have been exposed to discerning eyes. In my defence, I never expected anyone else to read those notes. They were conversations I was having with myself as much as with Harmon's text. I'm curious which passages resonated with you. The novel affected me deeply during a transitional period in my life when I was questioning many of my previous certainties. Perhaps that's why I couldn't keep my thoughts contained. If you're inclined to continue this unexpected correspondence, I would welcome hearing your thoughts on the book or on any other matter that interests you. Sincerely, Gary Wilson. Catherine wrote back the same evening, this time without agonising over every word. She quoted his annotation about solitude having dignity and explained how it had articulated something she'd felt but never named. She mentioned her favourite bookshops in the city and asked if he had recommendations. 2 weeks later, Gary's response arrived, longer this time, with observations about Catherine's observations and a list of bookstores worth visiting if she ever found herself in Albany. He asked about her work as a librarian and shared an anecdote about a memorable library from his childhood. By the third exchange, they had abandoned the formality of Dear Miss Mitchell and Mr. Wilson for first names. By the 6th letter, Catherine found herself sharing stories she had never told anyone, about the death of her father when she was 12, about a novel she'd started writing but abandoned, about her growing sense that life was passing her by while she watched from behind a reference desk. Gary's letters revealed a man who thought deeply but wore his intelligence lightly. He had taught English literature at a small college before leaving to write a book, which remained stubbornly unfinished, he admitted. He lived alone but didn't seem lonely, describing walks through woods near his home and conversations with an elderly neighbour who was teaching him to play chess. I've always believed that what we notice reveals more about us than what we say, he wrote in one letter. And I notice, Catherine, that your letters have become the highlight of my month. I find myself checking the mailbox with an eagerness that would embarrass me if anyone witnessed it. Catherine knew precisely what he meant. She had begun rushing home from work to check her mail, and on days when a letter from Gary waited, she would save it, preparing a cup of tea and settling into her favourite chair before carefully opening the envelope. In July, she sent him a pressed violet she'd found in Central Park. In August, he sent her a photograph of a spectacular sunset over a lake, with a note, "Wished you could see this. Words failed me." By September, the closing lines of their letters had evolved from sincerely to with warm regards to thinking of you. Catherine found herself imagining his voice, his laugh, the way his face might change when he was considering a difficult question. Then came the letter she had both hoped for and dreaded. Catherine, 6 months of letters, and I feel I know you better than people I've spoken with daily for years. There's a freedom in writing that conversation sometimes lacks, the space to consider words before committing to them, the absence of distracting facial expressions or interruptions. Yet I find myself increasingly curious about the woman behind these thoughtful letters. The way you tilt your head when you're listening intently, I imagine you do this. The sound of your laugh, whether you gesture when you speak as expressively as you write. I'll be in New York on October 12th. Would you consider meeting? I suggest Penn Station at 4 p.m. I'll be standing by the Neddick's hot dog stand holding a purple tulip. Your favourite flower, if I remember correctly from your April letter. If this suggestion makes you uncomfortable, I completely understand. Our correspondence has been a gift regardless. Thinking of you, Gary. Catherine read the letter 12 times. She wrote 4 different responses before settling on the simplest. Yes, I'll be there. Looking forward to it more than I can say. October 12th arrived with Catherine in a state of nervous excitement she hadn't experienced since childhood, Christmases. She changed outfits 5 times before settling on a rust-coloured dress that complemented her auburn hair and a camel coat against the autumn chill. She arrived at Penn Station 20 minutes early, then decided to walk around the block to calm her racing heart, which made her 5 minutes late. The station buzzed with Saturday afternoon travellers. Catherine scanned the crowd looking for the promised purple tulip. Her imagination had constructed a Gary Wilson who matched his letters, thoughtful eyes, an easy smile, perhaps greying at the temples though she imagined him around her age. Then she saw it, a single purple tulip held aloft above the crowd. Catherine navigated through groups of travellers, her pulse hammering in her ears. As she drew closer, her step faltered. The man holding the tulip was at least in his 60s, with silver hair and the slightly stooped posture of someone who had spent decades hunched over books. He wore a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches and a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes, keen and blue, scanned the crowd. Catherine felt a confusing mixture of emotions, disappointment, yes, but also curiosity and a stubborn affection for the mind she had come to know through his words. Age was just a number, she told herself, though the number was larger than she had anticipated. She approached him with a smile she hoped didn't reveal her surprise. "Gary, I'm Catherine." The man's face brightened. "Catherine, wonderful to meet you at last." He extended his hand, which she shook. His grip was warm and firm. "I was beginning to think you might have changed your mind." "Just circling the block to settle my nerves," she admitted. "Understandable. It's not every day one meets a pen pal who started as a book margin." He gestured toward a nearby bench. "Shall we sit for a moment before we head out? I thought we might walk through Bryant Park if that appeals to you." They sat, and Gary asked about her work, referring to specific details from her letters with impressive recall. Catherine found herself relaxing despite her initial shock. This was the same thoughtful person she'd come to know, just packaged differently than she had imagined. After about 15 minutes of conversation, Gary checked his watch and smiled. "I believe we should be moving along now." "Of course," Catherine said, gathering her purse. Gary stood and looked over Catherine's shoulder, raising his hand in a beckoning gesture. She turned to see a young man approaching, tall with dark hair and the same striking blue eyes as the man beside her. He wore a navy pea coat and carried a book. The older man's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Catherine Mitchell, may I introduce my son, Gary Wilson Jr.? Catherine's mouth fell open. She looked between the 2 men in confusion. The younger Gary extended his hand, his expression both amused and apologetic. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Catherine. I hope my father hasn't been too awful." Your father, Catherine repeated, feeling as if she had stepped into an alternate reality. Gary Sr. chuckled. I may have neglected to specify which Gary Wilson annotated that book. Junior inherited not only my name, but my tendency to argue with authors in the margins. This was your idea, wasn't it? Catherine asked Gary's father with fond exasperation. Entirely, the older man admitted without a trace of remorse. When Junior told me about this fascinating librarian he'd been corresponding with, I insisted on vetting you first. Call it paternal prerogative. Catherine looked at Gary Jr., understanding dawning. You wrote the letters. He nodded, colour rising in his cheeks. Every word. Dad just thought it would be funny to make sure you weren't some sort of book-obsessed axe murderer, Gary Sr. finished cheerfully. I approve, by the way. She's exactly as she seemed in the letters, Junior. Catherine couldn't help herself. She burst into laughter, the kind that comes from relief and absurdity colliding. When she could speak again, she playfully punched Gary Sr. in the arm. That was terrible of you. Guilty as charged, he agreed, not looking remotely contrite. But now that we've established you're not dangerous, unless one counts that right hook, I should head home before my wife thinks I've run off with a mistress. He winked at Catherine, then clasped his son's shoulder. Don't mess this up, Junior. As Gary Sr. walked away, his son turned to Catherine with a mixture of embarrassment and hope. I swear this wasn't my idea. I'd understand completely if you want to call it a day after this. Catherine studied him, the same height as his father but with broader shoulders, the same intelligent eyes but with laugh lines still in their early stages. He was holding a weathered copy of T.S. Eliot's collected poems. Do you argue with Eliot in the margins too? She asked. He glanced down at the book in his hands and smiled. Constantly. He's brilliant but occasionally insufferable. I think, Catherine said slowly, that I'd still like to take that walk, if the offer stands. I have a lot of questions about a certain annotated novel. They walked from Penn Station to Bryant Park, the October afternoon softening into early evening. Gary explained how the book had ended up at the bookstore. I was between apartments last year and had to sell some of my library. I tried to keep the books I'd annotated, but a few slipped through. I had to pack in a hurry when my old lease ended unexpectedly. Including the quiet hours, Catherine said, which somehow found its way to you. He glanced at her with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Dad calls that literary fate. The initial awkwardness dissolved as they fell into the easy rhythm they had established through letters. Gary asked about the reference question she had mentioned in her last letter, a woman researching the history of female lighthouse keepers, and Catherine found herself gesturing animatedly as she described helping the patron find obscure historical records. You do tilt your head when you're interested in something, Gary observed, looking pleased. I'd imagine that. Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. What else did you imagine? That you'd be thoughtful and articulate in person, not just on paper, that your laugh would be genuine, that you'd call me out if I said something pretentious. He hesitated, then added more quietly, that I'd feel as comfortable with you in person as I did writing to you. And do you? She asked. More so, he admitted. Letters let you curate yourself. This is messier, but better. They found an empty bench in Bryant Park and sat watching the last golden light fade from the sky. A street musician played saxophone nearby, the notes floating through the crisp air. Tell me something you didn't put in a letter, Catherine said. Gary considered this. I'm terrified of heights but love flying, which makes no sense. I can recite the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock from memory because I had an impossibly strict professor who required it. And, he paused, I almost didn't write back after your first letter, because I was afraid the reality of me wouldn't live up to whatever you imagined, based on those margin notes. I'm glad you did, Catherine said, even if your father's prank nearly gave me a heart attack. Your turn, Gary said. Something you didn't write. Catherine thought for a moment. I sleep with the window open, even in winter. I've kept every birthday card I've ever received in a box under my bed, and I've reread your letters so many times I've practically memorized them." The admission hung between them, a vulnerability offered without expectation. Gary reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm despite the cooling evening. "Would you like to get dinner?" he asked. "There's a little Italian place near here that serves tiramisu that might change your life." "That sounds perfect," Catherine said. The restaurant was tucked away on a side street, with candles in empty Chianti bottles and checkered tablecloths. Over pasta and red wine, they discussed books they loved and ones they couldn't finish, the merits of first-person versus third-person narration, and whether New York bagels were truly superior to all others. They agreed they were. "You mentioned in one letter that you left teaching to write," Catherine said as they lingered over coffee. "What are you working on?" Gary looked slightly embarrassed. "A novel, theoretically. It's been in progress for 3 years. What's it about?" "A man who inherits his grandfather's collection of rare books and discovers one contains a series of clues to a family secret." He took a sip of espresso. "More interesting than it is currently. I keep getting stuck on the third act." "I'd like to read it someday," Catherine said. "I promise to write notes in the margins." Gary laughed. "That would be fitting." After dinner they walked through the city, intentionally getting a little lost, discovering a hidden courtyard with a forgotten fountain, browsing a late-night bookstore where they challenged each other to find the most obscure title, and finally stopping for ice cream despite the October chill. At the entrance to the subway that would take Catherine home to her apartment in the village, they paused. "I have a confession," Gary said, suddenly serious. "I kept a copy of another book with my notes, a companion volume to The Quiet Hours. It's called The Luminous Dark. Same author." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Are you bribing me for a second date with the promise of more marginalia?" "Is it working?" he asked with a hopeful smile. In answer, Catherine rose on her tiptoes and kissed him lightly. "Yes," she said, "but I'd have said yes anyway." 2 years later, Catherine adjusted the framed photograph on her desk. She and Gary on the steps of the New York Public Library, his arm around her waist, both laughing at something now forgotten. Outside her office window, Columbia University's campus was blanketed in fresh December snow, students hurrying between buildings with hunched shoulders and colourful scarves. Her new position as Special Collections Librarian had come with an actual door she could close, a luxury she still hadn't tired of after 6 months. Today she was using that privacy to wrap Gary's Christmas present, a first edition of John Updike's Rabbit, run she'd found at an estate sale, miraculously within her budget. A knock interrupted her careful creasing of the wrapping paper. "Come in," she called, hastily covering the book with a folder. Gary poked his head in, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Ready for lunch?" "I'm starving." "Just finishing something up," she said. 5 minutes?" Instead of leaving, he entered and closed the door behind him, unwinding his scarf. "I had a surreal experience this morning," he said, perching on the edge of her desk. "A student asked if she could interview me about my novel for the campus paper." Catherine smiled. The publication of Gary's book 3 months earlier had been modest but meaningful. A small university press, respectable reviews, and most importantly the liberation of finishing something he doubted would ever be completed. "What did you tell her?" "That she should interview you instead," he said, "since you're the one who broke my writer's block." Catherine rolled her eyes, but couldn't deny the truth in his statement. After months of dating, she had finally convinced Gary to let her read his manuscript. Her detailed notes, some in the margins, others on separate pages, had helped him see the story from a new perspective. "Did you also tell her that the romantic subplot was entirely invented and bears no resemblance to us meeting through a book?" she asked. Gary laughed. "Some things are just for us to know." Catherine opened her desk drawer, and removed a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "Since you're here, you might as well have this now." Gary raised his eyebrows. "Christmas is still 2 weeks away." "This isn't your Christmas present," she explained. "It's an anniversary gift. 2 years ago today, I found a book with notes in the margins." Gary carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a slim volume bound in faded blue cloth. His eyes widened as he recognized the quiet hours. "How did you find it again?" he asked, turning it over in his hands with reverence. "I've been in touch with Mr. Grayson for months. He's been keeping an eye out, calling other booksellers. It turned up in a shop in Boston." Gary opened the book, fingers tracing his younger self's handwriting. "I can't believe some of the pretentious things I wrote," he said with a self-deprecating laugh. "Listen to this. Harmon understands that true connection requires vulnerability, but she fails to acknowledge the courage such vulnerability demands." He shook his head. "What did I know about vulnerability at 25? Catherine moved to stand beside him, looking over his shoulder at the familiar pages. "I fell in love with your mind through those notes." Gary closed the book and set it carefully on the desk, then pulled Catherine into an embrace. "And I fell in love with yours through your letters." He kissed her forehead. "I've been thinking, what if we wrote a book together?" "What kind of book?" she asked, intrigued. "Letters between strangers who connect through literature. We could each write one character's perspective." Catherine considered the idea, warmth spreading through her at the thought of creating something together. "I'd like that," she said, "as long as we promise not to let your father write the ending." Gary laughed and kissed her properly. "Deal," he said against her lips. "Though I have to admit, his plot twist worked out pretty well for us." On her bookshelf at home, Catherine had created a special section, her collection of books with meaningful marginalia. Some contained Gary's thoughts from before they met. Others held conversations they'd had in the margins since then, agreements and arguments and inside jokes captured in ink. And there was space for many more, a library of love letters built word by word in the white spaces that most people overlooked. The end. A Song for Anne. The clatter of carriage wheels on the cobblestones of Hampton Court was a frantic, irregular heartbeat counting down the final seconds of Anne's freedom. Through the thick, leaded glass, the palace rose from the autumn mist not as a home, but as a fortress of gilded stone and suffocating grandeur. Each turret and battlement seemed to whisper the same cold truth. Her life was no longer her own. In Brittany she was the Duchess Anne, a ruler in her own right, her will the law of the land. Here she was a political necessity, a name on a treaty, a womb intended to secure an alliance. The autumn wind, sharp and tasting of wood smoke and damp earth, whipped at the cloaks of the receiving party as she descended. At its head stood a boy who was not yet a man, Prince Arthur. He was handsome in a severe English way, his features fine-boned and his expression as placid as a frozen lake. He bowed, his movements precise and tutored. "Your Grace," he said, his voice clear but devoid of warmth. "Welcome to England. I trust your journey was not unduly arduous. The recent rains have made the roads to Dover quite treacherous, which has, in turn, delayed the Florentine wool shipments." Anne, accustomed to the passionate greetings of her own people, could only offer a small, tight smile. He spoke of trade, not of her comfort, of commerce, not of the country she had left behind forever. He saw the treaty, not the woman. She was led through echoing corridors, her silk gown rustling, like dry leaves skittering across a grave. Tapestries depicting epic battles and stoic saints absorbed the sound of her footsteps, their woven figures seeming to watch her with pitiless eyes. Everything was meant to impress, to intimidate, to remind her of the power she was being married into, and the powerlessness of her own position within it. Her private chambers were opulent, a cage spun from gold thread and carved oak. A fire roared in the hearth, but its heat could not reach the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Her ladies-in-waiting fussed around her, chattering in French about the richness of the fabrics and the quality of the silver ewers, but their words were a meaningless buzz, like flies against a window pane. Later that evening, at the welcome feast, Anne sat beside Prince Arthur, a silent effigy in crimson and gold. The great hall was a cacophony of clattering plates, booming laughter, and the drone of courtiers vying for favour. Across the sea of faces she felt 1,000 eyes on her, measuring her, judging her. They assessed her breeding, her posture, the slope of her neck, calculating her worth in future heirs. She took a sip of wine, the spiced liquid, a bitter balm on her tongue, and then she heard it. It wasn't the boisterous fanfare of the royal musicians, but something else entirely. A single instrument, a lute, played from a shadowed alcove near the great fireplace. The melody was not English, nor was it entirely Breton, but a sad, searching tune that seemed to understand the very shape of the ache in her chest. It was a melody of longing, of exile. Her eyes scanned the shadows, seeking the source. She saw him then. He was not dressed in the flamboyant livery of the court musicians, but in simple dark wool. His head was bent over his instrument, his dark hair falling across his brow. His fingers moved over the strings with a lover's intimacy, coaxing from the wood and gut a sound so pure and sorrowful it silenced the chaos in her mind. He was an island of quiet intensity in an ocean of noise. He looked up just for a moment, his gaze sweeping the hall, and for a fraction of a second his eyes, dark and deep, seemed to meet hers. There was no recognition, only a shared momentary stillness. Then a courtier laughed too loudly, the spell was broken, and he retreated back into his music, into the shadows. That night, alone in the vast cold bed, Anne listened to the autumn wind howling through the narrow windows of her chamber. It sounded like a lament. The flickering candlelight cast dancing giants on the walls, spectres of her new life. She thought of the cold prince, the prying eyes, the crushing weight of her jewelled gown, and she thought of the man with the lute, whose music had spoken a language she understood better than any words uttered that day. She pulled the heavy furs closer, a single tear tracing a cold path down her temple and into her hair. In Brittany I was a duchess, she thought, the words a silent, bitter refrain. Here I am merely a treaty signed in flesh. The song from the shadows was the only thing that felt real, a fragile thread of connection in a world of gilded isolation. It was a song for the lonely, and tonight she was its most devoted listener. The weeks that followed bled into one another, a dreary procession of grey skies and greyer duties. Late winter held the palace in its icy grip, and Anne's world shrank to the prescribed paths between her chambers, the dining hall, and the royal chapel. It was in the chapel, seeking a moment's respite from the ceaseless political manoeuvring of the court, that she found him again. He was alone, seated on a simple wooden bench, his lute resting across his knees. The cavernous space was empty save for the two of them, the air still and cold. He wasn't playing the sorrowful ballads of the great hall, but a light, intricate piece that danced in the solemn air, each note a spark of defiance against the gloom. The music stopped her breath. She stood in the doorway, hidden by the shadows of the arch, unwilling to break the spell. When the last note faded, its echo hanging in the air like a ghost, he sighed, a sound of deep personal satisfaction. It was then that he saw her. He startled, rising quickly to his feet and offering a clumsy bow. "Forgive me, my lady," he said, his voice a low tenor, richer than she'd expected. "I did not mean to disturb your prayers." He assumed, from her simple dress and uncovered hair, that she was one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. "You did not disturb me," Anne replied, her voice softer than she intended. She stepped into the weak light filtering through the stained glass. "Your music was beautiful." A faint, surprised smile touched his lips. "You are kind to say so. It is a simple piece, my own." The honesty of the encounter, free from the suffocating protocol that defined her every other interaction, was intoxicating. "I am Anne," she said, deliberately omitting her title. "Thomas," he replied, with a slight nod. "Just Thomas." Their first conversation was a hesitant dance. He spoke of the court with a wry, weary honesty, calling it a gilded cage where the birds sing for their supper. She found herself laughing, a real, unburdened sound that felt foreign in her own throat. She spoke of the music of her homeland, of lively Breton folk songs that smelled of the sea and open fields. This became their secret. They began to meet in the quiet corners of the palace, the disused music chamber with its dusty harpsichords, or the formal gardens where the first crocuses were beginning to push through the frozen earth. He taught her a sad, lovely English ballad about a knight and his lost love. In return, she hummed a Breton melody, a lullaby her mother used to sing. "Music needs no translation," Thomas said one afternoon, his fingers guiding hers on the neck of the lute. His touch was light, professional, yet it sent a tremor through her. The warmth of his shared breath in the cold room was more real than any jewel she'd been given. It speaks heart to heart. Their fragile harmony was shattered the day he discovered who she truly was. He had been waiting for her in the garden when he saw her walking with Prince Arthur, her ermine-trimmed cloak marking her as royalty beyond any doubt. The blood drained from his face. Later, when he saw her alone, the easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a chasm of rank and duty. "Your Grace," he murmured, his bow now as deep and formal as any other courtier's. "Thomas, please," she begged, the words catching in her throat. "I am a court musician," he said, his voice tight with a bitterness she hadn't heard before. "You are the future Queen of England. There is no please between us." The invisible walls of her station had risen around her once more, higher and more impenetrable than ever. He was right. Their connection was an impossible fantasy, a hidden harmony that could never be played for the world to hear. The engagement ceremony was set for the first day of May. As the date approached, the palace buzzed with preparations. The ringing of the chapel bells, meant to be a joyous proclamation, sounded to Anne like funeral tolls. They were not celebrating a union of love, but hammering the final nails into the coffin of her old life, of the woman she might have been. The woman who could laugh with a musician in a winter garden. The woman who was, for a few stolen moments, just Anne. The threat of discovery and the finality of her impending marriage did not sever the thread between Anne and Thomas. Instead, it pulled it taut, transforming their tentative connection into something sharp, bright, and dangerous. Their secret meetings became more infrequent, but infinitely more precious, charged with the energy of all they could not say in the open. One moonless night, Thomas led her not to the gardens or the music room, but up a winding stone staircase to a small, forgotten tower room where he kept his instruments. It was his sanctuary, a space that was wholly his. A single candle burned, its flame dancing in the draught, casting their shadows long and intertwined against the cold stone walls. "I cannot give you jewels or titles, Your Grace," he said softly, his back to her as he picked up his lute. "I have only this." He played for her then, a private concert in the heart of the sleeping palace. It was not a performance, it was a confession. Each note was a declaration, each chord a question. The music built from a tender, wistful melody into a passionate crescendo that spoke of desperate love and impossible longing. It was the sound of his heart laid bare. When the music finally faded, silence rushed in to fill the void, thick and heavy with unspoken words. Anne found she was crying, silent tears she hadn't realised were falling. "What will become of me, Thomas?" she whispered into the darkness. "When I am his wife, when I am queen, will I remember my own song?" He set the lute aside and turned to her. In the flickering candlelight she could see the anguish in his eyes, a mirror of her own. "I will remember it for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers brushed a tear from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark in the kindling of their repressed feelings. He took a step closer, and the space between them seemed to hum with a palpable energy. "Anne," he breathed, using her name like a prayer. And that was all it took. She moved into his arms as if she belonged there, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. He lowered his head, and their first kiss was not gentle or hesitant, but a collision of desperation and need. It was the taste of rain on dry earth, of solace after a long battle. As if on cue, a low rumble of distant thunder echoed from beyond the tower walls, a soundtrack to the storm breaking inside them. In the aftermath, wrapped in the safety of the small room, they shared their truths. He told her his own secret. He was the son of a minor noble, a lord who had backed the wrong side in the recent wars and lost everything, his title, his lands, his honour. Thomas was a musician not by choice but by necessity, a gentleman living in the shadow of his family's disgrace. The shame he carried, his belief that he was unworthy, suddenly made his quiet pride and bitter observations of the court make sense. His vulnerability unlocked her own. Inspired by his courage, by the raw, honest music of his heart, Anne felt a stirring of her own forgotten artistry. In the stolen hours of the following week, she began to compose again, scratching out melodies on scraps of parchment. The notes flowed from her like a confession, a secret diary written in a language only he could truly understand, but their stolen world was too fragile to last. A lady-in-waiting, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, began to notice Anne's absences. Her questions became more pointed, her gaze more suspicious. One evening, as Anne slipped away to meet Thomas, the woman's eyes followed her down the corridor, a glint of jealous calculation in their depths. The heartbeat of their love was now matched by the rhythm of approaching danger, and they both knew that the beautiful, dangerous crescendo they had built could not be sustained. It had to break. The final weeks before the wedding descended like a shroud. The palace became a hive of frantic activity, the sound of seamstresses in Anne's chambers like the frantic fluttering of 1,000 sparrows trapped in a cage. They swarmed around her, pinning silks and velvets, their needles flashing like tiny silver daggers. She stood for hours, a living doll being dressed for sacrifice, the weight of the brocade and pearls a physical manifestation of her inescapable duty. One afternoon, a page brought Thomas a sealed letter bearing a French crest. A patron in Paris, a duke who had heard of his talent, was offering him a position at his court, a prestigious appointment, a chance for a new life, and most importantly, a clean escape before scandal could erupt and ruin them both. The letter was a lifeline, but it felt like a noose. To accept it meant leaving Anne to her fate. The breaking point came not with a clash of swords, but with a quiet, overheard conversation. Passing the king's private study, Anne paused as she heard her name. The door was slightly ajar, and the voices of King Henry and Prince Arthur drifted out, cold and pragmatic. "She has strong hips and a healthy constitution," the king said, his voice laced with the dry calculation of a horse breeder. "God willing, she will be quick with a son. An heir is paramount. The alliance with Brittany depends on it." "She is quiet," Arthur noted, his tone indifferent. "She will not cause trouble. A broodmare." The word screamed in her mind, a brand of hot iron on her soul. Her value, her entire existence was reduced to her ability to produce an heir. She was not a partner, not a person, but a vessel. The last of her romantic illusions about finding some small measure of respect in this marriage dissolved, leaving a bitter, cold emptiness. That night, she met Thomas in the gardens, the wind howling around them like a keening grief. The air was electric with their shared misery. "I received an offer," he told her, his face a mask of turmoil. "From France. We could go, Anne. Together. We could disappear. I would work, I would play in taverns. It wouldn't matter, as long as we were free." He gripped her arms, his eyes wild with a desperate hope. "Come with me." It was the ultimate temptation, a life of love, music and freedom. But she saw the future with a terrible clarity. "If I run, the treaty is broken," she said, her voice hollow, her heart tearing with every word. "My people in Brittany will pay the price. Henry will see it as a declaration of war. I would be trading their safety for my own happiness. I cannot do that." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "I am the bridge between two kingdoms, Thomas, and a bridge cannot choose its own direction. It can only bear the weight." The truth of her words settled between them, heavy and suffocating. There was no escape. Her dark night of the soul had arrived, and she was utterly alone in her choice. Love or duty, her heart or her people. Thomas looked at her, his own hope dying in his eyes. He saw the iron will beneath her sorrow, the queen beneath the heartbroken girl. He understood. His sacrifice would be to let her make hers. He could not save her from her fate, but he could save her from the scandal of their love. "Then I will take the position in France," he said, his voice rough with unshed tears. He released her arms, and the cold rushed in where his warmth had been. "I will leave before the wedding. No one will ever know." He turned to walk away, his figure a dark shape against the tormented sky. Each step he took away from her was a note in a funeral dirge, the final breaking chord of their song. Dawn broke cold and grey over Hampton Court, the pale light filtering through the stained glass of the royal chapel like a final hesitant blessing. Anne found Thomas there, just as she knew she would. He was not praying, but standing in the centre of the nave, his travelling cloak already fastened. The groom waited with 2 horses in the courtyard beyond, their breath pluming in the frigid air, their hooves echoing her own frantic heartbeat. "You weren't going to say goodbye," she said, her voice echoing in the sacred silence. It was not an accusation, but a statement of painful fact. He turned, his face etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have aged him overnight. "A goodbye would only make the leaving impossible," he admitted. "It is kinder this way." "No," she said, stepping closer. "The kindest thing is the truth." She took a deep breath, gathering the strength she had forged in the crucible of her grief. "I am going to marry Prince Arthur. I am going to be Queen of England. But I did not simply surrender, Thomas. I went to the king. I negotiated." A flicker of surprise, of pride crossed his face. "I will fulfill my duties," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But I have secured a promise. My own household, my own musicians, a measure of control over my own affairs. I will not be a silent broodmare in a golden cage. I will have a voice. You taught me to find it." He understood then. It was not the ending they had dreamed of in the tower room, but it was not a complete defeat. She had not run away, but she had not broken either. She had found a third path, a path of duty infused with dignity. They could not have forever, but they had created something true, something that had changed them both irrevocably. "Your song," he whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You will not forget it." "Never," she promised, "nor yours." For their final farewell there were no more words. He retrieved his lute from a nearby pew. She took a small silver flute from a hidden pocket in her cloak, and there, in the empty chapel at dawn, They played. It was their final duet. He began with his English ballad, the melody of heartbreaking loss. Then she joined in, weaving the notes of her mother's Breton lullaby around his. The two melodies, one of sorrow, one of comfort, one of England, one of Brittany, twined together, creating a new harmony, a song that was uniquely theirs, a testament to a love that could find beauty even in the face of impossible difference. When the last perfect note faded, they simply looked at each other, their music having said everything. He bowed, a gesture of profound respect, and walked out of the chapel without looking back, 5 years later. The bells of London tolled, but this time they were for the death of a king. Anne, now the Queen Mother, a young widow after Arthur's untimely passing, stood on the balcony watching the solemn procession. She was a respected figure, known for her wisdom, her quiet strength, and her patronage of the arts. She had kept her promise to her people and to herself. That evening a package arrived, delivered by a messenger who had travelled far. It bore no name, only a seal of pressed wildflowers. Inside, nestled in silk, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a lark poised for flight. Beneath it lay a sheaf of sheet music. The melody was new, yet achingly familiar. It was a continuation of their song, filled with longing, but also with a deep, abiding peace. Alone in her chambers, Anne went to her clavichord. As her fingers found the keys, the melody filled the room, a sound that transcended time and circumstance. Some songs are meant to be sung once, in perfect harmony, their echo lasting longer than a lifetime of ordinary music. Anne closed her eyes, a small secret smile on her lips, and let the melody carry her back to a love that chose memory over possession, duty over desire, and in that choice found its own form of forever. The Venetian Masquerade, beneath the golden mask. The last vestiges of twilight bled across the Grand Canal, painting the rippling water in hues of bruised violet and fading gold. From her window in the Palazzo di Rossi, Alessandra watched the city she loved, a jewel box of flickering lanterns and distant, echoing laughter, slowly begin its nightly performance. The air, thick with the damp, ancient scent of stone and sea, carried the faint, jubilant strains of carnival music, a sound that felt more like a taunt than an invitation. It was a melody of freedom, a world away from the gilded cage of her existence. Her gaze drifted from the canal to the portrait that dominated the far wall of her chambers. Her mother, captured in oils and eternal grace, smiled a gentle, knowing smile. Alessandra moved toward it, her silk dressing gown whispering against the cool marble floor. Her fingers, trembling slightly, reached out to touch a worn, folded letter, tucked into the corner of the ornate frame. It was her father's final confession, not of sins, but of figures, a ledger of debts detailed in cold, merciless numbers. A lifetime of reckless wagers and failed ventures had left their noble name hanging by a thread now woven into her betrothal. "Forgive me, Mamma," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing in the cavernous silence. "I know you married for love. It was the one true fortune you possessed." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a hot, defiant drop against her cool skin. Her mother had been a merchant's daughter, married into nobility for a heart full of passion, not a coffer full of ducats. Now, Alessandra was expected to do the opposite, to sell her future to save their past. The weight of her mother's pearl necklace, a wedding gift she now wore daily, felt less like an heirloom and more like a manacle. Each iridescent sphere was a reminder of the life she was being forced to accept, a life bound to Conte Marcello. He was a man whose presence chilled the air, whose eyes appraised her not with affection, but with the cool, detached assessment of a merchant weighing goods. During his last visit, his touch had been a proprietary caress on her arm, his fingers cold and firm staking a claim. He spoke of alliances, of consolidating power, of the Rossi name being polished anew under his patronage. He never spoke of her, only of what she represented, a beautiful, well-bred key to the upper echelons of Venetian society he so desperately craved to unlock. Alessandra's reflection shimmered back at her from the darkened window pane. A pale, captive ghost. Dark hair, eyes the colour of Venetian dusk, a mouth that had forgotten the shape of a genuine smile. She saw the resignation settling in her features, the slow extinguishing of a light she once believed was unquenchable. Her lady's maid, Sophia, had laid out the fabrics for her wedding trousseau earlier that day. Creamy silks, gossamer thin lace, seed pearls like tiny frozen tears. They were beautiful, exquisite, the trappings of a gilded sacrifice. 3 days until the masquerade ball, her mind chanted, a grim litany. 3 days until my last night of anonymity, 3 days until I become someone else's possession. The ball was to be her final public appearance as Alessandra de Rossi, the unmarried daughter of a fading house. The next time Venice saw her, she would be the Contessa Marcello, her identity subsumed, her spirit shackled. A sudden, fierce rebellion surged through her veins, a hot, cleansing fire. It was a spark ignited by her mother's portrait, by the memory of stories of a love so potent it had defied convention. What was the point of honouring her father's memory by condemning herself to a loveless future? The debts were his, the shame his. Yet she was the one being asked to pay the price. The injustice of it was a bitter pill she could no longer swallow. She wouldn't just attend the masquerade, she would inhabit it. For one night she would not be Alessandra de Rossi, the dutiful daughter, the bartered bride. She would be a mystery, a fleeting dream, a creature of the Venetian night. She would dance with strangers, drink the forbidden wine of freedom, and breathe the air of a life she might have lived. It was a foolish, dangerous idea, a final, flickering act of defiance before the darkness closed in. Crossing the room, she opened a heavy cedar-lined chest at the foot of her bed. Beneath layers of linens and stored memories lay a box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a mask. It was a gift from her mother, from a time when carnival was a celebration, not a countdown to captivity. The mask was a masterpiece of gilded papier-mâché, shaped into the visage of a phoenix, its feathered crest sweeping elegantly upwards, its eyes holding a hint of both sorrow and fire. The golden surface was intricately detailed, catching the candlelight and throwing fractured, dancing patterns across her face as she lifted it. Her mother had called it her mask of courage. "When you feel caged, my little phoenix," she had said, her voice a warm melody, "remember that you have wings. You can always be reborn from the ashes." Alessandra held the mask to her face. Staring at her reflection now, she saw not a ghost, but a flicker of possibility. A woman she didn't recognize, a stranger with fire in her eyes. The melancholy that had clouded her heart began to recede, replaced by a desperate electric yearning. One night to be the phoenix, one night to soar before her wings were clipped for good. The decision settled not with a sense of peace, but with the thrilling, terrifying hum of a drawn bowstring waiting to be released. The grand ballroom of the Palazzo Grimani was a living kaleidoscope and a riot of sensation that overwhelmed and intoxicated in equal measure. Music from a string quartet swelled and swirled, a Viennese waltz that swept through the cavernous space, catching the rustle of silk gowns and the whisper of secrets shared behind feathered fans and jewelled masks. Towering Murano glass chandeliers dripped light like liquid diamonds, casting a glittering ethereal glow upon the throng of disguised nobility. The air was a heady perfume of melting wax, expensive florals, and the collective anonymous thrill of the masquerade. Alessandra, clad in a gown of deep crimson that felt as bold and defiant as her mood, moved through the crowd like a phantom. Her golden phoenix mask, her shield and her liberation hid the nervous flutter in her heart. Here, she was no one's daughter, no one's fiancée. She was simply a shape in the crowd, a flash of gold and crimson, a mystery waiting to be unravelled. She watched Conte Marcello from across the room, his peacock-like ostentation on full display as he held court with a group of older, influential men. He wore a simple black domino mask, but it did little to hide the predatory glint in his eyes. He scanned the room, and for a terrifying moment his gaze seemed to snag on her, but it slid past, unrecognising. A shiver of relief, cold and sharp, ran down her spine. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant, the bubbles a fizz of courage on her tongue. She was content to be an observer, a wallflower drinking in this last taste of life. But the music was a siren's call, and a profound loneliness began to ache within her, a longing to be part of the dance, not just a witness to it. It was then that he appeared, a figure emerging from the crush of bodies as if summoned by her unspoken wish. He was tall, his presence a pocket of stillness in the swirling chaos. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored coat of midnight blue velvet, and his mask was the same deep hue, unadorned save for a subtle silver filigree at the temples. It concealed the upper half of his face, but couldn't hide the strength of his jaw or the way his mouth curved into a faint, intriguing smile as he stopped before her. "A phoenix, signora?" His voice was a low baritone, a smooth, rich sound with an accent she couldn't quite place. Not Italian, something crisper, cleaner. How prophetic. Are you planning on rising from the ashes of this rather dull affair? Alessandra felt a jolt, a spark of connection that was as unexpected as it was potent. His directness was a refreshing breeze in the stuffy air of polite, veiled conversation. "Perhaps, Messere," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "Or perhaps I am simply admiring the flames before they consume everything." His smile deepened. "A poet as well as a prophetess. In that case, would you grant a mere mortal one dance before the conflagration?" He extended a hand. It was ungloved, strong and steady. She placed her hand in his, and the moment their skin touched, a current warm and electric arced between them. It was a shocking, intimate jolt in this room full of carefully constructed barriers. He led her onto the dance floor, and as the quartet slid into a new melody, they began to move. He was a masterful dancer, guiding her with a quiet confidence that was both commanding and gentle. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their steps were a conversation, their movements a perfect, unspoken harmony. It felt less like a dance and more like a recognition, a meeting of two souls who'd been moving to the same rhythm long before they ever touched. She found herself studying the details of him, the way a lock of dark, wavy hair fell across his brow, the clean, sharp scent of bergamot and sea salt that clung to him, a fragrance that spoke of ships and faraway lands. With every turn, every stolen glance, the tension between them coiled tighter, a silken cord of intoxicating attraction. This was more than a dance. It was a discovery. "You are not from Venice," she stated, her voice soft, meant only for him. "Is my accent so obvious?" he murmured, his lips close to her ear, sending another shiver through her. "I am English. A diplomat of a sort. My name is Gabriel." Gabriel. The name suited him. He spoke it simply, without title or fanfare. A British diplomat. The word sent a prickle of alarm through her. England and Venice were tangled in a web of shifting alliances and trade disputes. He was not just a foreigner, he was a potential adversary, a man her future husband would surely see as a threat. The knowledge should have made her pull away, but instead it added a dangerous, thrilling edge to their encounter. He was everything forbidden, everything she should avoid. When the music finally softened to a close, they stood for a moment, breathless, their hands still linked in the centre of the glittering ballroom. The noise and the motion of the crowd seemed to fade into a distant hum. Reality, with its sharp edges and cold obligations, was beginning to press in. "The air in here has grown thick," Gabriel said, his gaze intense. "There is a balcony overlooking the canal. Would you join me for a moment of quiet?" She gave a single decisive nod. He didn't release her hand, but instead threaded his fingers through hers, a bold and possessive gesture that made her heart leap. He led her away from the dance floor, through a set of French doors, and out into the cool, moon-drenched night. They were alone. The music was a muted whisper behind them, the only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the palazzo's stone foundations, and the frantic beating of her own heart. The moonlight silvered the edges of his mask, casting his mouth and jaw in sharp relief. Slowly, as if asking for permission, he reached up with his free hand and gently untied the ribbon of his mask, letting it fall away. His eyes, now revealed, were a startling clear blue, the colour of the sea on a winter's morning. They were kind eyes, yet they held a deep melancholic wisdom, as if they had witnessed more sorrow than a man his age should know. And, his gaze fixed on her mask, he lifted his hand to her face. His touch was feather-light, hesitant, a stark contrast to Marcello's cold possession. With a shared breath, he reached for the ribbons of her phoenix mask. The world seemed to stop as he slowly, carefully, began to untie the knot, preparing to reveal the woman behind the golden facade. The golden phoenix mask slipped from her face, and in the pearlescent moonlight, Alessandra felt utterly, terrifyingly exposed. The cool night air kissed her skin, a startling sensation after the warmth and anonymity of her disguise. Gabriel's sea-blue eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw not the disappointment or calculation she might have expected, but a look of profound, almost reverent recognition. He didn't know her name, but he saw her. "Alessandra," she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her own lips after a night of being nobody. "Alessandra," he repeated, his voice a soft caress. "It's beautiful." He didn't release her, but instead let his thumb trace the delicate line of her jaw, a touch so tender it made her tremble. "Your mask was of a phoenix, now I see why. There is fire in you." Before she could fashion a reply, he gestured toward a stone bench in a hidden alcove of the Grimani Gardens, shrouded by overgrown jasmine vines whose white blossoms perfumed the air with a cloyingly sweet scent. They sat, the city's distant revelry a mere murmur. The quiet felt more intimate than any crowded ballroom. He told her he was a British diplomat tasked with investigating whispers of corruption in the Venetian trade routes, a rot that threatened to poison relations with England. "I came to Venice for duty, Alessandra," he confessed, his gaze fixed on the dark, shimmering water of the canal. "I never expected to find my soul." The raw honesty of his words unlatched a door in her own heart. The carefully constructed walls of duty and resignation began to crumble. "And I," she began, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know it possessed, "came to this ball for one last night of freedom. In 2 days I am to be married." She didn't say to whom. She didn't want to taint this perfect stolen moment with Marcello's name. But the weight of the admission hung between them, heavy and cold. Gabriel's hand, which had been resting near hers on the bench, covered her own. His warmth was a small, solid anchor in the swirling tide of her emotions. "To a man you love?" he asked, his voice gentle, devoid of judgment. Alessandra laughed, a short, bitter sound. Love is a currency my family can no longer afford. It is a political arrangement to secure my family's name. A shared silence fell, filled with the unspoken understanding of loss and sacrifice. He told her of his older brother, a naval officer lost to a cannonball in a skirmish with French privateers. He was the brave one, Gabriel said, a shadow passing over his handsome features. I have spent my life trying to live up to his ghost, shackling myself to duty as a way to honour his sacrifice. I believed it was my penance, that my touch destroys what I love. In turn, she spoke of her parents, of their passionate whirlwind love that had been the talk of Venice, and of the slow, tragic decline after her mother's death from a sudden fever. Her father, lost in his grief, had gambled away their legacy, chasing the ghost of a happiness he could never recapture. Their stories, though born of different circumstances, resonated with the same painful chord of love and loss. It was as if they were two halves of the same fractured soul, finding their missing piece on a moonlit balcony in Venice. How can 3 hours feel like a lifetime, yet pass like a heartbeat? She murmured, more to herself than to him. Because some moments are a lifetime, he answered, turning to face her fully. He suggested a gondola, a desire to escape the palace grounds entirely, to steal a few more moments from the relentless march of time. They found a lone gondolier dozing near a small private dock, and soon they were gliding through the city's liquid labyrinth. Away from the grandeur of the Grand Canal, the smaller waterways were quiet, mysterious, flanked by the sleeping faces of ancient palazzos. The only sounds were the gentle splash of the gondolier's oar and the distant haunting melody of a lone singer somewhere in the night. The gondola slipped into the narrow channel leading toward the Bridge of Sighs. The enclosed bridge loomed above them, a dark, poetic link between the Doge's palace and the prison. Legend claimed that lovers who kissed in a gondola beneath it at sunset would be granted eternal love. But under the stark silver light of the moon, it felt more poignant, a place of endings and the beginnings. As they passed into the shadow of the bridge, the gondola slowed. Gabriel reached out, his fingers gently cupping her face. The world narrowed the space between them. The moonlight, the water, the distant music, it all faded away, leaving only the intensity of his gaze. He leaned in and she met him halfway, a silent, mutual surrender. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, then deepening with a passion that mirrored the desperate, aching longing in her own soul. It was not the chaste, passionless kiss of a betrothed couple. It was a kiss of discovery, of hunger, of two people finding a home in one another. It was a kiss that tasted of champagne and salt and bittersweet possibilities. It was a promise and a heartbreak all at once, a perfect, impossible moment suspended in time. As their lips parted, the first hint of dawn was bruising the eastern sky, a pale, pearly grey that threatened to shatter their nocturnal spell. The magic was dissolving, the beautiful illusion giving way to the cold, hard light of day. Reality, with its impending wedding and political duties, was no longer a distant threat but an imminent, crushing certainty. The spell was breaking, and the ache in Alessandra's chest was the sound of her heart tearing in two. The chiming of the clock in the Piazza San Marco was a relentless metallic heartbeat, each hour a nail in the coffin of Alessandra's freedom. Dawn had broken, stripping the magic from the Venetian night and leaving behind a stark, unforgiving reality. Her wedding was tomorrow. In her chambers, Sophia moved with a sombre reverence, laying out the ivory silk of her wedding dress. The gown, which had once seemed merely beautiful, now looked like a shroud. Its intricate lacework was a web, its train a chain. Alessandra stared at it, her body numb, her mind still replaying the kiss beneath the Bridge of Sighs, the feel of Gabriel's hand in hers, the impossible hope he had ignited. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office near the Rialto Bridge, Gabriel's world was also unravelling. His investigation had borne bitter fruit. Poring over shipping manifests and intercepted letters by the light of a sputtering candle, he had found the linchpin of the corruption, the Venetian nobleman secretly funneling information and diverting British cargo for his own profit. The name on the documents, signed with an arrogant flourish, made his blood run cold. Conte Marcello. The revelation struck him with the force of a physical blow. This was not just a political matter anymore. The man who held Alessandra's future in his cold, calculating hands was a traitor and a thief. Gabriel's love for her had now become politically dangerous, a liability that could not only jeopardize his mission, but could place Alessandra in the direct path of Marcello's wrath. If the Conte discovered their connection, he would not hesitate to use her, to crush her, to ensure her silence. The thought of his love bringing her harm was a torment worse than any penance he had ever imagined. His instinct, honed by years of duty and the guilt from his brother's death, screamed at him to protect her by disappearing from her life. His choice felt like a betrayal of his own soul, but he saw no other way. He began to burn the few mementos from their night together. A dried jasmine blossom from the garden, a sketch he'd made of her phoenix mask from memory. He watched the paper curl and blacken, the image of her vanishing into smoke. It was a sacrifice, he told himself, for her safety. He penned a formal report to his superiors in London, and a separate, hastily scribbled note to Alessandra, a note filled with agonizingly vague apologies, and a promise that his actions were for her own good. He booked passage on a merchant ship leaving for England on the evening tide. That afternoon, Conte Marcello paid a visit. He found Alessandra in the Palazzo's formal salon, her face pale, her eyes hollow. He mistook her despair for bridal nerves. "Soon, my dear," he said, his voice slick with satisfaction. "All of Venice will envy you. Your family's name will be restored, polished to a brighter sheen than ever before." He took her hand, his touch possessive. "You are a wise woman to accept your duty. Refuse me and your family's name dies with your father's debts. Your father's legacy will be one of shame, whispered in every corner of this city." The threat was veiled, but the malice behind it was crystal clear. He was not her saviour, he was her jailer. As Sophia helped her into the wedding dress for a final fitting, something inside Alessandra snapped. The silk felt coarse against her skin, the veil a suffocating cloud. This wasn't duty, it was erasure. This wasn't saving her family's name, it was destroying her own soul. As Sophia turned to fetch her pearls, Alessandra reached up, her hand shaking with a furious energy, and tore the gossamer veil from her hair. The sound of ripping silk was a cry of rebellion, a sound of liberation. Just then, a street urchin, bribed by a handsome coin, delivered Gabriel's note. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The words were a dagger to her heart. "Forgive me, I must leave Venice. It is the only way to keep you safe." Safe? He thought a life with Marcello was safety. He thought a gilded cage was preferable to a shared risk. He was choosing for her, just as her father had, just as Marcello had. He was repeating the mistakes of his past, trying to protect someone by pushing them away, by silencing their voice in their own destiny. A desperate, defiant fire raged through her. She would not be a passive victim in her own story. She would not let him sacrifice their potential for a misguided sense of honour. Ripping off the suffocating bodice of the wedding gown, she threw on a simple dark cloak, her movements frantic and purposeful. She had to find him. She flew from the palazzo, a shadow moving through the labyrinthine streets of Venice as dusk began to fall. She ran through crowded campos and down deserted alleyways, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't know where his ship was docked, but she ran toward the sea, toward the smell of salt and tar, her only guide a desperate hope. She found him on a remote quay, his silhouette stark against the fading light, about to board a small tender that would take him to the anchored ship. "Gabriel," she cried, her voice raw. He turned, his face a mask of shock and anguish. "Alessandra, you shouldn't be here." "Don't you dare choose for me," she gasped, rushing to him, her hands gripping the front of his coat. Her eyes, wild with passion and fury, blazed up at him. "You speak of duty and safety, but you know nothing of it. Safety is not a life without love. It's a prison. If our love is dangerous, if we are to be destroyed, then let it be a fate we choose together, not one you impose upon me." Her words struck him with the force of truth, shattering his carefully constructed rationale. In her eyes, he saw not a woman who needed his protection, but an equal, a warrior willing to fight for their future. He saw the fire of the phoenix, and he finally understood. Protecting her didn't mean leaving her. It meant standing with her. "The consequences," he started, his voice thick with emotion. "Damn the consequences," she whispered, her hands moving to cup his face. "Damn the debts, and the duty, and the ghosts of our past. Choose me, Gabriel. Choose us." In that moment, standing on the edge of the dark, whispering water, with the city of masks and secrets behind them, he made the only choice that mattered. He pulled her into his arms, his kiss a desperate, fierce confirmation. They would flee, together. Whatever the price, they would pay it side by side. 1 month later, the sound that woke Alessandra was not the chiming of a clock or the distant cry of a gondolier, but the gentle rhythmic sigh of waves washing over a sandy shore. Seabirds called to one another in the bright, clean air. She opened her eyes to a room filled with sunlight, the salty breeze rustling the simple linen curtains of a window that looked out not onto a canal, but onto the vast, brilliant expanse of the Adriatic Sea. Gabriel was sitting at a small wooden desk, the morning light catching the gold in his dark hair as he wrote. They had found refuge in a secluded villa on the coast, a place far from the gilded cages and shadowy politics of Venice. Their escape had been a frantic, desperate affair, a blur of secret passages and moonless nights, facilitated by one of Gabriel's loyal contacts. In the weeks that followed, they had lived simply, their world shrinking to the confines of the small house and the endless sea. It was a world built not on legacy or obligation, but on stolen moments and a shared, quiet joy. Gabriel sealed the letter he was writing and turned, a warm smile spreading across his face as he saw she was awake. He crossed the room and handed her a different letter, one that had arrived the previous day by diplomatic pouch, its seal bearing the crest of the British monarchy. "It's over, cara mia," he said softly, his voice full of a relief so profound it was almost tangible. Her hands trembled as she read. Gabriel's report on Conte Marcello, sent before their flight, had been corroborated by other sources. An investigation had been launched, and the full extent of the Conte's treasonous dealings had been exposed. He was ruined, his assets seized by the Venetian council, his name now a synonym for disgrace. But the letter contained another, more startling revelation. In their investigation, the authorities had uncovered Marcello's predatory financial dealings, including the unjust terms of the arrangement he had forced upon her father. The Rossi debts were declared void, a product of criminal coercion. Her family's honour, the very thing she had been forced to sacrifice herself for, had been restored not by her marriage, but by the truth. Tears welled in Alessandra's eyes, not of sorrow, but of a dizzying, overwhelming gratitude. They had not destroyed her family, they had, in a strange, circuitous way, saved it. "Love isn't about finding someone you can live with, cara mia," Gabriel whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Someone you cannot live without." He knelt beside the bed, taking her hand in his. "I spent so long believing I was destined to live a life of penance. You taught me that true honour lies not in solitary sacrifice, but in the courage to build a life with the person who holds your heart. Later that day, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they were married. There was no priest, no audience, no silken gown or string quartet. Their ceremony took place on the beach at sunrise, witnessed only by the sea and the sky. Alessandra wore a simple white sundress, and Gabriel a plain linen shirt. They exchanged simple hand-forged iron rings, their vows a quiet promise whispered over the sound of the waves. It was honest and real and more sacred than any cathedral ceremony could ever have been. In their small villa, her golden phoenix mask now hung in the window. It was no longer a symbol of a desperate final flight, but a testament to their rebirth. Each morning it caught the sun's rays, scattering prisms of light across the room, a daily reminder of the night their two worlds collided. She was no longer the caged bird, and he was no longer the lonely diplomat bound by ghosts. They were simply Alessandra and Gabriel. She stood with him on the cliffside overlooking the water, his arms securely around her waist. His evidence and diplomatic service had earned him not a reprimand, but a pardon and a new, less perilous posting in England. They would sail tomorrow, toward a new life, a future they would write themselves. Some say we lost everything, Alessandra thought, leaning her head against his shoulder as they watched a ship sail toward the horizon. A title, a palazzo, a place in Venetian society, but how can it be lost when you've gained your soul? They held each other, their new wedding rings catching the last brilliant rays of the setting sun. They had navigated the labyrinthine canals of duty and deception and emerged into the clear, open waters of truth. They had learned that the greatest masquerade isn't the mask you wear to a ball, but the inauthentic life you accept out of fear. Theirs was a love bodged in secrets and starlight, a love that had dared to choose courage over comfort. And as the Venetian dusk once more painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, their quiet laughter, a melody of hard-won peace, was carried out to sea, two souls who had risked everything and in doing so had gained it all. Beneath the broken sky. The sky didn't just weep, it raged. Jake Mitchell had spent half his life in the air, a nomad of the jet stream, but he had never seen a storm like this. It was a living, breathing monster, a churning vortex of black cloud and horizontal rain that clawed at his helicopter with savage intent. Below, the world had dissolved into a brown, churning sea, a landscape of flooded countryside where rooftops poked through the surface like lonely gravestones. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Rescue 1!" he'd yelled into the radio minutes ago, his voice swallowed by a roar of static. "Engine failure! I'm going down!" There was no response. There was only the wind's deafening shriek and the sickening groan of the rotor blades losing their fight. He was a man who saved people, plucking them from the jaws of disaster. Now the jaws were closing on him. He scanned the deluge for a patch of solid ground, anything that wasn't submerged. A sliver of gold, a wheat field, miraculously spared on a slight rise, appeared through the grey sheet of rain. He aimed for it, his hands moving with the ingrained memory of 1,000 drills. The controls felt sluggish, a dying animal in his grip. He braced for impact. The landing was less a landing and more a controlled fall. Metal screamed as the skids hit the soft earth, digging deep, sending mud and wheat stalks flying. The helicopter tilted, a wounded beast collapsing onto its side. The main rotor blade, already fractured, snapped with a sound like a giant's bone breaking, scything through the air before embedding itself in the saturated ground. Jake's head slammed against the side window, glass spider-webbed, then shattered. The world dissolved into a concussive flash of white, then a profound ringing silence. The storm for a moment was muted. Sarah Michaels had been watching the storm from her farmhouse window, 10-year-old Tommy a silent, anxious presence beside her. The lights had flickered and died an hour ago, plunging them into a world of candlelight and shadows. Every roll of thunder was a physical blow, vibrating through the old floorboards and up her spine. It was a familiar fear, a ghost from her childhood that the rumbling sky always resurrected. Then she saw it, a dark shape tumbling from the bruised heavens, not a bird. Something mechanical, something failing. It disappeared behind the stand of ancient oaks that bordered her property. The crash was a muffled percussive thud that was felt as much as heard. "Stay here," she told Tommy, her voice steadier than her hands. "But what was it?" he asked, his eyes wide in the flickering gloom. "I don't know, but you're not going out there." She pulled on her rubber boots and a heavy raincoat, grabbing the largest flashlight she could find. The wind ripped the kitchen door from her hand, slamming it against the exterior wall. Rain, cold and stinging, plastered her hair to her face. She fought her way toward the oaks, mud sucking at her boots. The sight of the mangled helicopter in her wheatfield was surreal. It looked like a fallen god, its metallic skin gleaming wetly in the intermittent flashes of lightning. A strange, almost sacred silence hung over the wreckage. As she drew closer, she saw the shattered cockpit, and inside a man slumped and unmoving. Tommy appeared at her elbow, his small face pale. "Mom, is he—" "I told you to stay inside," she snapped, then immediately softened, pulling him into her side. "I'm sorry." "Go back to the house, please, Tommy. It's not safe." He hesitated, then obeyed, his small figure swallowed by the storm. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She circled the wreck, her flashlight beam cutting through the rain. The pilot's door was jammed shut. She found a rock slick with rainwater, and after a moment's hesitation, she smashed the remaining glass of the side window, clearing a path. The man was wedged in his seat, a dark gash on his forehead painting his temple crimson. His flight suit was torn, his breathing shallow. She reached in, her fingers trembling as she pressed them against his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady, a thrum of life in the midst of all this chaos. "We can't leave him," she thought, a whisper in her own mind. Somehow she unbuckled him. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She hooked her arms under his and pulled, dragging him through the broken window frame, away from the smell of fuel and rain. He groaned, a low, guttural sound that was the first sign of consciousness. By the time she had him halfway to the farmhouse, Tommy was there again, a small, determined soldier in the face of the storm, helping her pull. They laid him on the braided rug in front of the cold fireplace. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in a stark blue-white strobe. The unconscious pilot, the terrified boy, and the woman who had pulled a man from the sky. Jake awoke slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, dark ocean. The first thing he registered was the scent of lavender soap. The second was a gentle, rhythmic pressure on his forehead. He blinked, his vision swimming. A warm, golden light pulsed softly. Candles. A woman's face hovered above him, etched with concern, her dark hair falling in damp tendrils around her shoulders. She was cleaning the cut on his head with a soft cloth, her touch as precise and delicate as a watchmaker's. Outside, the storm still howled, the rain drumming a relentless tattoo against old window panes. The chaos outside was a perfect mirror for the roaring confusion in his chest. His voice was a dry rasp. You saved my life." She looked up from her work, her eyes, the colour of rich dark earth, meeting his. A small sad smile touched her lips. The storm did the rest. Morning arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper. Pale, watery sunlight filtered through the streaked kitchen windows, painting dusty motes of gold in the air. Jake woke to the soft, rhythmic turning of a page. He was on a sofa, a thick, hand-stitched quilt tucked around him. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but the world had settled back onto its axis. Across the room in a worn armchair sat Tommy, his brow furrowed in concentration as he read a book, his feet dangling inches from the floor. The sight of the boy's quiet innocence was a balm, a stark contrast to the adrenaline and danger that had defined Jake's life for as long as he could remember. It reminded him, with a sudden sharp pang, of everything he had lost, or rather, everything he had never allowed himself to have. The smell of coffee, rich and inviting, drew his attention to the kitchen. Sarah stood at the counter, her movements practiced and graceful as she poured hot water over fresh grounds in a ceramic dripper. She wore a simple grey sweater, her hair tied back, and in the gentle morning light she looked less like the storm-soaked rescuer from the night before and more like a figure from a half-forgotten dream of peace. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft. "How's your head?" "Like a drum solo," he admitted, slowly sitting up. The quilt smelled of cedar and something faintly floral. Home, the word ambushed him. "Thank you for everything." "It's either that or leave you to rust in the fields," she replied, a hint of dry humour in her tone. She handed him a steaming mug. The ceramic was warm against his palms. "Tommy's father left 3 years ago. He's not used to having a man around the house, especially one who falls out of the sky." The statement was delivered simply, a fact laid bare without drama, yet the word "left" hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. It was an echo of her own fear. Tommy, sensing the shift in conversation, looked up. "Are you a real pilot?" Jake managed a smile. "Most days. Yesterday, I was more of a professional crash tester." He took a sip of coffee. It was strong. Perfect. "What are you reading?" "The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe," Tommy said, holding up the book. "Mum's making me do a report. I have math homework too, but I hate fractions." An hour later, Jake found himself at the sturdy oak kitchen table, a pencil in his hand, explaining how to find a common denominator. He discovered a surprising patience within himself, a gentle corner of his soul he rarely accessed. He saw the way Sarah watched them, a tentative curiosity in her eyes as she graded papers at the other end of the tunnel. He was a stranger, a piece of wreckage from a violent world. Yet here, in this sun-dappled kitchen, he felt a sense of belonging that was both foreign and deeply seductive. Later that afternoon, Sarah led him outside. The air was clean, washed new by the storm. The floodwaters had receded slightly, leaving behind a slick of mud and debris. She showed him her garden, a patch of earth behind the house. Last year's floods had nearly wiped it out, she explained, but she had rebuilt the raised beds, fortified the soil, and replanted. Tomato vines, heavy with green fruit, climbed their stakes. Rows of lettuce and kale stood in neat, resilient lines. It was a testament to her tenacity, a living metaphor for her refusal to be washed away. "It's not much," she said, her hands brushing against a fragrant rosemary bush, "but it's mine, something to nurture." She had dirt under her fingernails, a smudge of it on her cheek. Jake found it beautiful. That evening a fire crackled in the hearth, warding off the damp chill that had settled in after the rain. Tommy was asleep upstairs. The house was quiet, wrapped in a blanket of rural silence broken only by the snap of burning logs. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Sarah asked, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Of saving people? The chaos?" Jake thought for a long moment, the firelight playing over his rugged features. "I've never known anything else," he admitted, his voice low. "My father was in the army. We moved every 2 years. I never learned how to plant things. I've never stayed anywhere long enough to watch anything grow." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and filled with a raw honesty that startled them both. It was a confession, an admission of a different kind of emptiness. Sarah's expression softened with an understanding that went beyond words. Do you ever get tired of being left behind? The question was a quiet echo of his own, a vulnerable offering from her own guarded heart. It wasn't an accusation, but a shared acknowledgement of their parallel scars. He, the man who always left. She, the woman who was always left. In the warm, flickering silence that followed, something shifted. The space between them, once filled with the caution of strangers, was now charged with the fragile, powerful current of recognition. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended reality. The world outside the flooded valley ceased to exist. Power was still out, the roads impassable. For Jake, it was the longest he'd been grounded in over a decade. He fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the farmhouse. He spent his days making repairs, the rhythmic thud of his hammer against the damaged roof a steady counterpoint to the drone of Sarah teaching Tommy his lessons at the kitchen table. Their conversations flowed as easily as the creek that bordered the property, meandering from trivial topics to deeper currents of their lives. He told her about the places he'd been, the earthquake zones, the hurricane-ravaged coasts, and she spoke of the small town she'd never left, of the joys and challenges of moulding young minds. They were two halves of a whole he'd never known existed, the adventurer and the nurturer, the sky and the earth. With every shared glance, every lingering touch as they passed in a doorway, the magnetic pull between them grew stronger, an invisible tide rising in the quiet corners of the house. On the third afternoon, as Jake was securing a loose shutter, Tommy approached him, his small face serious. "Are you going to leave like my dad?" The question was a stone dropped into a still pond, its ripples expanding to touch both adults. Jake stopped hammering, his gaze finding Sarah's across the yard. He saw the familiar flinch in her eyes, the tightening of her jaw. This was the question that haunted her waking moments. I don't know, kiddo," Jake answered honestly, kneeling to be at the boy's level. "My job is out there." He gestured vaguely at the wide open sky. "My dad's job was out there too," Tommy said quietly, before turning and running back toward the house. The exchange left a palpable tension in the air, a storm cloud of a different kind gathering on the horizon. Later, as dusk settled, casting long shadows across the living room Sarah sought to explain, she retrieved a small silver-framed photograph from the mantelpiece and handed it to Jake. It showed a young girl with a bright, hopeful eyes, standing next to a man in a pilot's uniform. The man was handsome, beaming with pride, his arm wrapped protectively around his daughter. "My father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a crop duster. He loved the sky more than anything. When I was 12, his plane went down in a storm not unlike the one the other night. They said it was mechanical failure. Suddenly, everything clicked into place for Jake. Her fear of the thunder, the way she'd flinched when a lone military cargo plane had passed high overhead yesterday. Her deep-seated terror wasn't just of abandonment. It was a specific, visceral fear of losing someone she loved to the very thing he considered his domain. The sky was his sanctuary and her graveyard. "Sarah," he began, his voice thick with a new understanding. He set the photograph down gently. "I'm not him." She looked at him, her beautiful guarded eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "How can I believe that?" she whispered, the question a raw, desperate plea. "You live in the clouds. Your whole life is about flying into the heart of the storm. How can I not be terrified of watching you fly away one way or another?" He had no answer for that. Duty was etched into his soul, a part of his identity. But in that moment, looking at her, he felt that identity cracking. He saw a future he'd never dared to imagine, one rooted in soil and sunlight, not wind and altitude. He stepped closer, closing the space between them. The air grew thick, electric. He could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, see the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. The distant rumble of another approaching storm mimicked the thunder in his own chest. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently cupping her cheek. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut as if in surrender. The kiss wasn't a gentle exploration. It was a collision. It was soft and desperate, hungry and full of a profound, aching tenderness. It was the frantic culmination of 3 days of unspoken longing, a release of the tension that had been coiling between them since the moment she'd pulled him from the wreckage. It was the taste of coffee and rain, of fear and hope. For Jake, it felt like landing after a lifetime in freefall. For Sarah, it felt like a terrifying, beautiful leap of faith. It was a silent promise, full of all the words they were too afraid to say, sealed in the charged quiet as the first drops of a new storm began to fall. The kiss had broken something open, a dam of restraint and fear. But as the new storm rolled in, more ferocious than the last, reality came crashing back with it. The battery-powered radio, their only link to the outside world, crackled to life with a terrifying urgency. Mandatory evacuation for all residents in the Cedar Valley. Repeat, this is a mandatory evacuation. The Northwood Dam has sustained critical damage. Structural failure is imminent. The valley is expected to flood within the next 4 hours. The robotic voice filled the small farmhouse, a harbinger of doom. Sarah's face went white. She looked out the window at the creek, already swollen and angry, its muddy water churning. This wasn't just a flood, it was an inundation. "We have to go," Jake said, his pilot-in-command voice taking over. "Now! Pack a bag. Essentials only." As if summoned by his words, the radio squawked again, but this time it was a familiar voice cutting through the static. "Rescue 1, this is Search Command. Jake, do you copy? We have a visual on your downed aircraft. We're dispatching a boat to your coordinates for extraction. ETA 30 minutes. Do you copy?" It was his team, his world calling him back. "This is Mitchell," he yelled into the small handset he'd salvaged from the helicopter. "I copy, Command. I have 2 civilians with me, a woman and a child. Roger that, we'll take all 3 of you." Relief washed over Jake, swift and absolute. They would be safe, but when he turned, he saw Sarah standing frozen, her arms wrapped around herself. Her expression wasn't one of relief, it was one of grim, heartbreaking resolve. "I'm not going," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "What, Sarah, you heard the man. The dam is failing. This house, everything, is going to be underwater." "This is my home," she said, her eyes flashing with a fierce protective light. "I rebuilt it from the mud once before. I will not be chased out by the water again. I won't abandon it." He couldn't understand. It wasn't bravery, it was suicide. This isn't about being chased out, it's about survival. Tommy, hearing the raised voices, ran into the room, his face etched with fear. He latched onto Jake's leg, his small body trembling. "You promised you wouldn't leave," he sobbed, the words a dagger in Jake's heart. "You promised." Jake was torn in two. A violent internal storm raged within him, more powerful than the one outside. The sky was calling him back. Duty, instinct, everything he had ever been, was pulling him toward that extraction boat, toward his team. But his heart, a stubborn and newly awakened anchor, was here, in this house, with this woman and this boy. For the first time, the call of the sky felt like a siren song luring him to his own destruction, while the terrifying prospect of staying felt like salvation. He looked from Tommy's tear-streaked face to Sarah's defiant one. He saw her fear, masked by a stubborn pride he was beginning to understand. She wasn't refusing to leave her house. She was refusing to be a victim again, refusing to let the storm win. He grabbed the radio handset. "Command, this is Jake. Negative on the extraction." "Say again, one?" The voice was incredulous. "The entire valley is going under." "I know," Jake said, his decision solidifying with every word, "but the civilians are refusing to evacuate their home. I can't force them, and I won't leave them." He paused, the weight of his next words settling on him. "I'm staying." A moment of stunned silence from the radio. "Jake, that's your life." "This is who I am," he said, his voice raw, looking directly at Sarah. "I save people." He let the handset drop. He turned to her, his eyes pleading for her to understand. "But you were right. Sometimes saving them means staying." Her defiant facade crumbled, replaced by a wave of shock, terror, and a fragile, dawning hope. The sound of the rescue boat's engine grew louder in the distance, then faded as it turned and disappeared down the valley, the sound of their last chance leaving. The creek had already breached its banks, its dark water creeping across the lawn. The river beyond was a torrent. "We have to get to higher ground," Jake commanded, his voice clear and steady. The choice was made. The sky had been denied. "We'll take what we can to the barn, and the hayloft is our only shot." He grabbed the silver-framed photograph of her father from the mantelpiece, pressing it into her hands. It was a silent acknowledgement. He understood. As the first wave of floodwater lapped at the porch steps, they worked together. A small, desperate family against the rising storm, carrying their most precious belongings. Not furniture, but memories and a newfound, terrifying love, toward the only sanctuary they had left. Dawn broke not with a triumphant fanfare, but with a quiet, sacred hush. The sky, scrubbed clean by the storm, was a delicate watercolour of rose and gold. From the high hayloft of the barn, Jake, Sarah and Tommy watched the sun crest the bruised horizon, its light glinting off a vast, silent sea. The valley was gone, submerged beneath a placid brown lake. Only the tops of the tallest trees and the roofs of a few buildings on the highest ground remained, islands in a drowned world. Their farmhouse was submerged to the eaves, a wounded survivor. But they had made it. Huddled together under horse blankets, listening to the water lap against the barn walls all night, they had survived. That sunrise marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. 6 months later, the water was a memory, leaving behind a landscape of mud, renewal, and relentless work. The valley was healing, and so were they. Jake never left. The crash that had brought him here had also grounded him in a way he'd never thought possible. With his savings and a small business loan, he had started a local emergency response centre, a small-scale operation with 2 all-terrain vehicles and a rugged inflatable boat. He was still saving people, but now they were his neighbours. He saved them from flash floods, from farm accidents, from the small disasters of rural life. He'd found a way to answer the call of duty without leaving the woman he loved. He hadn't chosen earth over sky, he had learned to hold them both. Sarah's garden was thriving again. The soil enriched by the flood's silt was dark and fertile. Her neat rows of vegetables were a testament to her enduring spirit. But now something new was woven among the sunflowers and tomato cages. Hanging from the sturdy stalks were Jake's old pilot medals glinting in the sun. He'd given them to her one afternoon, a quiet offering of his past. She had placed them here among the growing things, intertwining the man he was with the man he was becoming. Tommy had changed too. The quiet, anxious boy had blossomed. The fear in his eyes had been replaced by a bright, confident spark. He spent his afternoons at the response centre, which Jake ran out of the repaired barn, learning how to check the oil in the ATV and coil ropes with a perfect knot. He wasn't afraid of the emergency radio anymore. He saw it as a tool for helping, a connection to the father figure who hadn't left. He was learning about engines and preparedness, about courage and partnership. One warm evening, as the sun began to dip below the rebuilt fence line, Jake found Sarah in the garden, her hands buried in the rich soil. He didn't have a diamond ring. He had spent his life accumulating experiences, not possessions. Instead, he held out his hand. In his palm lay a set of keys. One was old and brassy, the key to the farmhouse. The other was new and shiny, the key to his truck. The last was a small silver key to the front door of the response centre. "I used to think home was wherever I landed," he said, his voice steady and full of a quiet, profound certainty. He looked from the keys in his hand to her face, illuminated by the golden light. A temporary base, a place to sleep before the next mission. Sarah slowly stood up, wiping her earthy hands on her jeans. Her heart felt impossibly full, a vessel brimming with a love she had once believed was lost to her forever. He curled his fingers around the keys and held them out to her. "Now I know it's not," he continued, his gaze locking with hers. "Home isn't a place you land. It's the place you choose to stay. The place you build and rebuild and fight for." He took a breath. "Will you build a home with me, Sarah?" Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so deep it was almost painful. She didn't need a ring, she didn't need a flowery promise, she needed this. The solid, tangible weight of permanence, keys that jangled like wind chimes, promising shared doors and a shared future. She closed her hand over his, over the keys, her touch warm and sure. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, always. Those storms tear everything apart. They leave behind nothing but wreckage and sorrow. But others, the ones you weather together, the ones that strip you down to the very core of who you are, they don't destroy. They reveal what was strong enough to last all along. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to open your door to a stranger falling from a broken sky, you discover that home was never a place at all. It was a choice, it was a promise. It was the safe harbour you find in someone else's heart.